Harold slumped in the recliner he once shared with quiet news in ritual comfort. Chest tight, vision narrowing to a pale vignette. Rusty climbed the arm like a sentry taking a post, churring in urgent pulses, tapping Harold's forearm whenever his eyelids sagged toward oblivion. The room hummed with refrigerator breath and storm-damp air as the Bobcat's purr deepened into a steadying engine, a low vibration that seemed to search for the faltering beat beneath an old ribcage. The lamps threw amber ovals across carpet worn thin by years, and the clock insisted on moving forward, one stubborn second at a time. Harold tried to sink, but Rusty refused the drift, holding him to the surface with sound, warmth, and insistence. Why was a wild heart keeping clinical time for a fragile one? And how many nights like this had passed unspoken, witnessed only by fur, breath, and a promise unvoiced? Morning broke reluctantly over a house that had fought for breath all night. The neighborhood stirred, but inside, no ambulance wailed and no neighbors crowded the porch. Pride stitched Harold to the chair. Secrecy had become a habit heavier than blankets. Rusty shadowed every movement, pacing from window to chair, trilling in patterns that felt like instructions learned by touch. The phone glowed with worried messages, unanswered, their concerns stacked like unread mail. The coffee sat cooling, untouched, while Rusty pressed his flank to Harold's ribs until the shiver softened. Somewhere deep, a diagnosis slept like a coiled wire, never named aloud, never shared across the kitchen table. This wasn't the first vigil and wouldn't be the last. A question flickered in the stale air. How long can denial masquerade as strength when a bobcat keeps time like a metronome and refuses to let the silence win?
The day's first jolt wasn't pain but percussion, a hard knock of bureaucracy against a thin door. A surprise welfare check loomed on the calendar with the bluntness of a red stamp. A neighbor's complaint carried photographs from angles no one should have reached, a trespass masked as civic duty. Paperwork became oxygen. Latches and tethers transformed into proof of care rather than symbols of captivity. Rusty watched from the hallway like a monarch in a modest court, tracking every anxious shuffle. The clock on the oven blinked its demand for corrections, signatures, and compliance. Conditional kindness had rules, and the rules would decide whether the living pulse beside Harold could stay. If fear wears the face of caution, what face does love wear when measured in forms, checklists, and the steady gaze of a wild companion waiting for verdicts written in ink? The accusation arrived sharpened by grief and printed on official paper, but it was the embedded photographs that sliced. An eye pressed to a fence gap, a lens peering over a boundary, a shadow captured just inside a private sanctuary. The words called Rusty a threat and Harold reckless, but between the lines lived a different ache. The photos were taken from within, not beyond, a trespass born of panic rather than malice. Loss had a way of breaking rules when the heart staggered. Harold felt pride recoil and tenderness rise, two instincts colliding like weather fronts. Rusty answered the tension with a stillness that read as discipline, sitting square and calm, pupils open but unafraid. Why had a neighbor risked offense to gather ammunition, and what exactly was she trying to save? Herself, her memories, or a street still learning to share its mornings with stripes and sorrow?
A gust slid through the hallway and found the backyard gate, lifting the latch with the slyness of weather. Rusty stepped into cold air that smelled of wet wood and last night's worry. He moved to the porch edge, paused at the invisible plate where warm house met raw season, and sat. He didn't leap the fence or vanish into hedges. He watched the window where Harold's outline wavered, a guardian on the outside of comfort. The wind dragged leaves across concrete like thin applause. Rusty lowered his head, placed a twig on the threshold, and drew a simple boundary that read like intention. Wildness was a river, loyalty was a crossing refused. If fear warned that instinct would win, why did a bobcat draw a line and decline to step over it until the man inside rose and chose to breathe forward? Clipboards clicked like small hammers against nerves as the welfare team crossed into a yard that had forgotten bloom. Double latches shone, tethers hung ready, spill-proof feeders lined up with military neatness. Rusty tracked their orbit with unblinking patience, a quiet sovereign tolerating the census. Harold led them to the far fence, where neglect had once built a thorned kingdom. There, a single blaze of color interrupted green, a revival born without announcement. The first rose had opened the morning Rusty arrived, a coincidence or covenant, impossible to say. The officials wrote notes, while the air carried damp earth and the faint sweetness of return. If proof can be counted in hardware and paper, can it also be counted in petals and breath? Somewhere beneath the soil, a root knitted itself to hope, binding old love and new presence with a fiber stronger than regulation.
A missing signature glared up from the page like a dropped stitch in an heirloom sweater. Everything else was in order. Every latch, every feeding schedule, every emergency plan. Yet the void where ink should have lived felt like a verdict. Years earlier, a different promise had awaited that line. A plan never completed. A partnership ended too soon to sign. Bureaucracy has little sympathy for ghosts, and blanks rarely entertain context. Rusty brushed Harold's calf with a deliberate pass, an anchor disguised as a greeting. The officials remained clinical, which is another way of saying careful. The choice assembled itself with cruel clarity: correct the absence under new terms, or surrender the presence that had turned a house back into a home. If love is measured by what you will sign, what do you call the courage it takes to place a pen where grief once trembled? Evening arrived gilded, the sky writing a slow letter in rose and gold across a familiar horizon. Rusty stepped into the doorway's light and lifted a melody no sheet music could hold. The sound was more purr and less than speech, a braided thread of trills and soft vibrations that registered somewhere behind the ribs. The song appeared only on days when heaviness sat beside Harold like an uninvited guest, and this was one of those days. The notes felt learned rather than invented, as if memory had taught them. The porch smelled of cut stems and fresh soil. The house behind exhaled warmed air over old wood. If grief has an anniversary, perhaps comfort does too. Rusty faced the dying sun, voice quieting as color drained from cloud. The last tone hung like a hand on a shoulder, lingering just long enough to be believed.
The crossroads came on unremarkable letterhead, presenting itself with tidy language that hid the weight beneath. Move Rusty early to a new facility and guarantee safety through separation, or climb a steeper path and stand as a bridge between wildness and human wonder. Educational Ambassador, the phrase read, a title that sounded ceremonial but demanded rigor. Training, public readiness, emergency protocols, composure under noise and new sense. The risk belonged to effort. The reward belonged to togetherness that served others. Harold felt the tug of caution and the pull of purpose, both powerful and honest. Rusty waited at the doorway line he had drawn with a twig, eyes on the man who had learned to breathe again. Some choices divide the heart, others stitch it larger. If love is a shelter, perhaps its walls expand best when a door is opened for the world. The harness lived on the table like a question. Rusty's shoulder blades shifted under patterned fur as Harold approached, hands steady, breath measured. The loop slid over ears that twitched, but did not flee. Buckles found their quiet clicks, not as shackles, but as signals agreed upon by patience. Outside, the threshold pressed its old challenge. Rusty extended one paw into colder light, paused, and pivoted back to Harold's tapping cadence. Recall is not magic, it is memory braided to safety. The yard became a classroom, where wind tutored focus and distant traffic graded composure. When the test asked whether a wild heart could choose relationship over reach, Rusty answered by returning before the question finished forming. Behind the hedge, a hidden witness watched with eyes wet from storms that had nothing to do with weather. Trust sometimes performs in quiet, but its echo carries far.
The fence had been a border and a shield, but it also hid tremors traveling yard to yard. The complaint's architect stood with arms folded tight against air that felt colder than the calendar promised. Her gaze darted between Harold's cautious posture and Rusty's composed silhouette. Accusations softened under the weight of truth. A spaniel's empty collar tucked into a coat pocket, the memory of a last night spent listening for footsteps that never returned. Fear had borrowed the language of protection. Grief had drafted the report. Rusty's presence had become a mirror she wasn't ready to face, not a threat she needed to erase. Tears are a kind of signature no form can counterfeit. The street exhaled. The fence still stood, but understanding stepped through a gate that had stayed closed too long. Not every rescue wears tags. Some rescues arrive striped, steady, and impossibly patient. The email landed like a pebble in a still pond, rings of consequence pushing out into every plan. The timeline shortened without apology, a clean change that made the hours in between suddenly precious and loud. Training expanded to fill mornings. Checklists multiplied across the refrigerator door. The house shifted into rehearsal mode, each room a small stage for composure, recall, and calm under disruption. A distant zoo had expressed interest, and the word felt like a horizon widening and a door threatening to close. Futures can pull in opposite directions without either being wrong. Rusty adapted with an athlete's economy, saving energy where it could be spared, spending attention where it mattered. The rose garden held its breath beneath frost warnings. When clocks accelerate, the soul asks what can be secured before the next chime. Harold answered by showing up, again and again, with steadier hands.
Unease returned as softly as fog, settling into joints and thoughts before anyone named it. Harold's chest lifted in shallow sips, reluctant to draw deeply from a room that smelled of brewed coffee and old books. Rusty climbed onto the cushion edge with slow ceremony and pressed along Harold's side until the space left for doubt narrowed. The purr began not as comfort, but as intention, a low, consistent wave that spread through fabric and bone like warmth poured into a chilled cup. The clock on the mantel faded to a blur as awareness latched on to rhythm, breath calibrating to sound, fear negotiating with sensation. Outside, a branch tapped the window with the patience of rain not yet arriving. If medicine sometimes comes packaged in instruments and prescriptions, sometimes it arrives striped, humming, and unwilling to let sleep pull a companion too far from the shore. Dawn found grit on the tongue and resolve in the hands. The welfare team returned with polite faces and eyes trained to notice absence disguised as order. Harold demonstrated the double latch sequence like choreography, steps learned until muscle kept time. Danny recited safety rules with an earnest precision that grew another inch of trust between generations. Rusty performed calm as a practiced art, ears rotating like quiet satellites, paws set square, gaze steady but soft. The yard offered evidence not just of compliance, but of care measured in repeatable habits. Connections matter on paper, they matter more in posture. A final checklist waited for ink. Clouds paced above like patient judges. In a world that measures readiness in boxes and signatures, the strongest argument arrived in the way a wild heart stayed when it could have slipped away between one blink and the next.
Silence stretched thin enough to hum, while decisions arranged themselves just beyond hearing. A stamp hit paper with firm intention, the sound small yet seismic. Conditional approval granted the fragile luxury of continued effort, a promise with homework attached. Training would intensify,
A final review would anchor itself to a date already sacred, the day Margaret planted her first rose. Time braided memory and responsibility into a single cord strong enough to pull the house forward. Rusty exhaled one long, controlled breath and settled beside Harold's shoe, a quiet punctuation to a tense paragraph. Victory rarely arrives with trumpets. Sometimes it looks like access to another morning of doing the work. The yard brightened as cloud cover thinned. Separation stepped back a pace, still present, still possible, but for now kept at the boundary by ink, intention, and the daily courage of showing up prepared. 2 months earlier, dust motes turned the living room into a soft galaxy as the carrier door faced the only figure not moving fast. Rusty's amber eyes met the lined map of a man's face drawn by years, and something electric passed without spectacle. The Bobcat's breath matched the older man's exhale, pure mimicry or pure instinct, impossible to condemn and unnecessary to resolve. The house had been large and quiet. Now it grew smaller in a good way, like a glove rediscovering a hand. The first step out of steel and mesh landed without chaos, a careful placement that promised observation before action. Rituals rearranged themselves to accommodate presence. The refrigerator hummed at a new tempo. The air agreed to be warmer. The day wrote a different sentence than planned, and both hearts recognized a rhythm they hadn't known they were missing until sound returned.
Territory was negotiated with a kind of humor that required no audience. The left arm of the recliner became a runway, then a throne, then a compromise carved by patience. Rusty stretched like a ruler laid diagonally over old leather, one paw dangling with theatrical confidence, tail curling into punctuation. Harold found himself making space without surrendering comfort, a small choreography of coexistence where neither felt displaced. Laughter arrived unannounced, light and surprising, loosening the grip of afternoons that had dragged. The chair had witnessed years of muted evenings. Now it developed opinions. A newspaper tried to be a shield and became a toy. Daily life turned from gray to textured, not louder but decidedly more alive. The room learned the weight of a new presence and adjusted its balance. A throne shared is a home claimed, and the kingdom that formed required only gentleness. Mornings turned ritual into duet. A bowl, a spoon, a steam ghost rising from oats. A dish, a surface tension circle on water, whiskers registering the ripple of room light. Harold lifted the spoon. Rusty lifted a paw, not as a trick but as timing, two metronomes finding sync across species. The table held placemats like appointments. Without thinking, a new one appeared labeled in block letters, an offering made to order and to memory. Sunlight crawled across the laminate and warmed the courage to stay seated longer than habit allowed. The refrigerator door, once a billboard for reminders no one read, grew useful again beneath a magnet that pinned the day's first smile. Small choreography repeated until it mattered. Routine isn't the enemy of wonder when wonder shows up regularly and brings a steady gaze. 2 rituals, 1 heartbeat, and the morning understood its assignment.
As dusk collected colors and sorted them into shadows, the living room became a newsroom with 1 anchor and 1 correspondent. Rusty's vocal run-up began low and curious, rising to complex phrases that hit pause at just the right places, inviting response without insisting on it. Harold found pace in replies that needed no quotes, just the acceptance that attention counts as language. The television ceded control of the hour, volume down to make room for a conversation that was more like weather than debate. The Bobcat's ears triangulated interest, the man's posture uncurled into ease. Loneliness loosened its belt and sat farther away. Silence didn't leave, but it learned better manners. If the measure of home is whether your voice matters inside it, then a striped editor had greenlit a show that refused cancellation. Stories returned, followed by appetite, followed by sleep that wasn't hollow. The rosebed out back held a map of avoidance drawn in thorns and scattered canes. It was the only place Harold hesitated to look straight at. The the ground-level shrine to promises postponed. Rusty stepped beside the worst tangle and sat as if attendance alone could change a season. The pruning shears felt heavier than their steel, carrying years of postponed decisions in their hinge. The first cut sounded louder than the traffic on the next street, a crisp syllable that ended one sentence and began another. Old growth surrendered to angles of light that hadn't reached soil in too long. Sweat ran thin and clean down an unpracticed neck. The air smelled of green bitterness and the relief that follows honest work. Sometimes apology is spelled with labor. Sometimes love returns to where it was planted and starts again without asking permission.
A red flare lit the green like a match struck in a dim room, small yet sovereign. It was not the finest rose ever grown, just the bravest, opening its palm to a world that had forgotten how to accept gifts. Harold stood still enough to hear his own breath and counted petals as if counting mattered. Rusty chirped twice from the patio edge, the sound less commentary than attendance. Dishes later clinked in warm water without resentment. Hum drifted from a throat that had spent months silent, an accidental tune dredged from years. Windows opened. A cross breeze shook curtains into life. Scent, color, sound, motion. 4 corners of a house set upright after leaning. When nature chooses its timing, it rarely asks for our calendar. The bloom did not erase grief. It located it in a larger garden, one that could hold both ache and promise without contradiction. The voice at the property line carried the brittle edge of fear disguised as certainty. The fence, once simple wood and wire, became a stage for a small drama about risk, responsibility, and memory. Rusty retreated a measured step, not in submission, but in choice, eyes never leaving the person who fed and listened. The yard held its breath as gaze met gaze across slats, each side reading the other with imperfect fluency. A dog tag appeared later, hum on a nail like a note without paper. Grief often speaks in objects because sentences cost too much. The street learned that caution and compassion can stand in the same patch of shade without arguing. The neighbor left with shoulders still tight, yet some stiffness had drained from her jaw. Boundaries protect and isolate. Learning which function you're using is part of coming back to life.
A binder thumped onto the kitchen table with the satisfying weight of competence. Pages explained feeding ratios, emergency protocols, handling ethics, and the choreography of calm. Magnets lifted old coupons from the refrigerator to make room for checklists color-coded by urgency. Sharpies labeled storage bins. Hooks appeared where confusion once sat. The house shifted from passive shelter to practiced habitat, a place that could demonstrate care without performance. Rusty inspected the transformations with the solemnity of a foreman, approving by proximity when systems made sense, relocating when they didn't. Preparation is a love language, precise and unflashy. The rules read like boundaries and felt like promises. Harold wrote them on the whiteboard in a hand steadier than last month's, line after line until the space filled with intention. Safety isn't suspicion, it is hospitality extended to a wild heart that agrees to stay. Thunder rolled a few test bowls across the sky before spilling anything serious. Lights dipped and recovered. Rusty's ears flicked, then oriented toward the oldest sound in the room, the slow tap Harold drummed on the chair arm. The pattern wasn't random. It held the shape of a hymn that had once floated above hospital tiles and wedding cake crumbs. Repetition turned memory into ground. The Bobcat settled, purr braided with weather until the house learned the difference between noise and threat. Candles waited unlit as the refrigerator negotiated with the grid. The storm never earned an emergency, but the drill counted anyway. Calm is not the absence of disruption. Calm is a choreography practiced when nothing dramatic is happening so that muscle remembers when it does. By the time the rain committed, the living room had already decided to remain untroubled and together.
Water ran warm, and dish soap drew small galaxies on the surface.
Hands moved in circles that felt ceremonial rather than menial. Some truths arrive only when the body is busy enough to let the heart speak. The admission flowed without witnesses, except for a striped sentinel who pressed close and turned listening into shelter. Disappearing had been easier than expected. Returning took work disguised as routine. A number was dialed, and an appointment claimed a corner of the calendar that had long stayed blank, where care should have been. Rusty brushed by with gentle insistence, an usher guiding someone to the right seat in a theater about to start. The sink cleared, the counter dried. The air felt lighter by a measurable amount. Sometimes courage is simply scheduling what should have been scheduled and then telling the future you intend to arrive. The days shortened, in both daylight and bureaucracy, deadlines nipping at the edge of chores. Training sessions stacked like bricks, each one placed squarely enough to bear weight. Danny took to the role of junior handler with a seriousness that softened worry across generations. The yard became a circuit of drills that measured recall, composure, and the art of choosing to return. The phrase, 2 weeks, echoed louder than thunder, resetting priorities with every sunrise. Rusty adopted a runner's calm, conserving effort until effort was asked. Meals grew less hurried, paradoxically, because haste confuses animals and undermines trust. The rose bushes tucked tight against frost, storing quiet energy for a season that couldn't be hurried either. The house met urgency with choreography rather than panic. On certain evenings, the porch hosted a silence so full it sounded like hope getting comfortable.
Morning arrived crisp, turning breath visible and decisions sharper. The twig line still marked the threshold where outside met in, a simple mark that had gathered meaning. Rusty paused there, waiting for the cue that would determine direction. The roses crackled faintly in the chill, a soft applause from plants that understood perseverance. Harold held the form that would define the path ahead, the title heavier than paper suggested. Educational Ambassador promised responsibility, visibility, service, and the humility to keep learning. The signature settled, steady and deliberate, onto the page that would keep a wild friend home by asking both of them to give the world something sturdy. Rusty stepped forward after the pen lifted, crossing the twig-like ceremony rather than accident. Choices rarely solve everything, they simply orient the next mile. Orientation can be enough to start walking together. The neighbor came without bluster, holding a small frame with 2 faces that shaped a whole story. She placed it on the porch rail beside another photograph that had anchored this home for years, the 2 sets of eyes staring outward in gentle vigilance. Words were few because grief already knew the language spoken here. Attendance replaced accusation. Acknowledgement replaced argument. Rusty watched from the doorway watched back, and the street felt less like a dividing line and more like a shared hallway. Fear seldom dissolves in a single afternoon, but it thins when it stands near courage and refuses the urge to run. Invitations to future demonstrations crossed the air, unadorned and sincere, and the fence began to feel less like armor. Some peacemaking is loud. Some is a hand setting a photograph down exactly where it belongs.
The gym smelled like floor polish and pencil shavings, a blend of young energy and institutional calm. Chairs scraped into semicircles, eyes widened, some with delight, some with startled caution. Rusty stood in harness, a picture of composure painted in spots and muscle, ears tracking sound without chasing it. Harold spoke with a steadiness borrowed from practice and returned as confidence, explaining rules like invitations rather than barricades. The first questions arrived in hesitant staccato, then in a cheerful rush. A shy child hung back at the edge of the circle until a soft trill found her, a note perfectly calibrated to curiosity. Shoulders lowered. A smile flickered, then settled. Education can look like a bridge thrown across a river that thought it was too wide. Today, the span held. Tomorrow promised more crossings, each one building a little more trust in the engineering of kindness. Evening wrote another closing paragraph in warm colors that refused to apologize for their beauty. The porch gathered Harold and Rusty into its familiar hold, planks storing the day's footsteps like stories saved for winter. The song returned, softer than the last time, threaded with assurance rather than alarm. Photographs on the side table caught light and offered it back. One life honored, one life remembered, one life standing beside the singer. The roses breathed a faint perfume into air, just cold enough to keep it honest. Harold's heartbeat kept even time without bargaining. The house settled with the satisfying murmurs of a structure fulfilling its purpose. Healing had not arrived as a miracle, but as a long series of choices to attend, prepare, prune, sign, and show up. Somewhere between wildness and tenderness, a promise found its voice and decided to stay.